A black elderly man fed a poor woman every day. One day, 10 Navy SEALs showed up at his door. Elena Rivera was drying the breakfast dishes when she heard the sound. It wasn't an ordinary knock. It was the kind of sound that makes your heart stop, firm, authoritative, impossible to ignore. She rushed to the window of her third-floor apartment and looked down. What she saw made her drop the plate she was holding. 10 men in formal military uniforms stood lined up on the sidewalk in front of the building. Medals gleamed on each of their chests. One of them, with more stars than the others, was knocking on the ground-floor apartment door. Harold's apartment. Elena's heart raced. Harold was 74 years old, lived alone, could barely afford rent. Why would military officers be looking for him? She dropped everything and ran down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. When she reached the ground floor, Harold had already opened the door. He stood there, leaning on his cane, staring at the men as if he were seeing ghosts. The officer in front, a white man with gray hair and a face marked by scars, stepped forward and gave a perfect salute. "Master Chief Harold Washington," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It took 23 years, but we finally found you, sir." Harold didn't move. His eyes, usually so calm, were wet. "Jenkins." His voice came out as a whisper. "Tommy Jenkins?" "Yes, sir." The officer smiled, but there was pain in that smile. "And I brought the others. Everyone you saved in Mogadishu." Elena stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what she was seeing. Harold? Master Chief? The same Harold she'd known for 8 months, who lived on a minimum pension, who wore patched-up clothes and never complained about anything. She thought back to the first time she'd met him. It had been in March, on a freezing rainy day. Elena was sitting at the bus stop, crying. She had just lost her job at the packaging factory. Cost cuts, they said. As if her life were just a number on a spreadsheet. At 32 years old, a single mother with a 6-year-old daughter, she had no idea how she'd pay that month's rent, let alone feed her child. That's when Harold appeared. He walked slowly with his cane, a black umbrella in his other hand. He stopped in front of her and, without saying a word, held out the umbrella. "The rain won't stop anytime soon," he said simply. "And you're going to catch a cold." Elena looked up at him, confused. "What about you?" "I live right there." He pointed to the building across the street. 3-minute walk. "You look like you have a longer way to go." She wanted to refuse. Wanted to say she was fine, that she didn't need charity. But something in his eyes, a kindness without judgment, made her accept. The next day, Elena returned the umbrella. Harold invited her in for coffee. She discovered they lived in the same building, on different floors. He asked about her life. She told him more than she intended. When she mentioned she was looking for work, Harold asked if she knew how to cook. "My mother taught me," Elena replied. "Simple food, but good." "Then we have a deal." Harold smiled. "You cook for me 3 times a week, and I'll pay you the equivalent of your old salary." Elena almost laughed. "You can barely pay your own rent. I hear the super knocking on your door every week. Leave my finances to me." His voice was firm but gentle. "I'm offering honest work. Do you accept or not?" She accepted. She had no choice. What Elena didn't know, what no one in the building knew, was that Harold Washington received a substantial military pension. Enough money to live comfortably. But he never spent it on himself. Every extra cent went to people like Elena. To the widow on the 4th floor who needed medication. To the teenager on the 2nd floor who dreamed of college. Harold lived with the bare minimum because he chose to. "Why do you do this?" Elena asked once, months later, when they developed a genuine friendship. "Why do you help everyone except yourself?" Harold was silent for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't understand at the time. "Because once I couldn't save the one who mattered. Now I try to make up for it, one person at a time." He never explained what that meant. Elena never asked again. But now, watching 10 Navy SEALs standing at Harold's door, she was beginning to understand there was much more to this man than he'd ever revealed. The problem was, not everyone was happy about the military's arrival. Across the hallway, the door to apartment 1B swung open. Richard Thornton, the building's owner, appeared with his face red with anger. He was 58, white, and for the past 6 months had been trying to evict Harold so he could renovate and triple the rent. What's going on here? Thornton advanced, pointing his finger at Harold. I have an eviction order for this man. He's 3 months behind on rent. Officer Jenkins turned slowly. His gaze could freeze hell. And you are? Richard Thornton, owner of this building. And this tenant is in violation of his contract. Jenkins looked at Harold, then at Thornton. A cold smile formed on his face. Mr. Thornton, the man you're trying to evict saved the lives of 47 American soldiers in one of the most dangerous operations in military history. He received the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and 2 Bronze Stars. Thornton paled but didn't back down. That doesn't change the fact that he owes 3 months' rent. Actually, Jenkins pulled an envelope from his pocket. It does. Because we're here to correct an injustice that's lasted 23 years. And when the media finds out how an American war hero has been treated in this building. He let the sentence hang in the air. Thornton's face went from red to white in seconds. What no one there knew yet was that Harold Washington's story was far more complex than medals and secret missions. And that the coming days would reveal truths that would change everyone's life in that building, especially Elena's. If this story of courage and secrets has captured your attention, subscribe to the channel to discover what really happened in Mogadishu, and why Harold spent 2 decades hiding from his own heroism. The hours that followed were a whirlwind. The 10 Navy SEALs entered Harold's small apartment as if they were entering sacred ground. Men who had faced the worst war scenarios stood silent before the poverty of the place. A patched-up sofa, an old television, a refrigerator that made strange noises. Jenkins looked around, his jaw clenched with restraint. Master Chief, how long have you been living like this? Harold shrugged. 23 years, give or take. It's enough. Enough. Another SEAL, a stocky black man named Davis, stepped forward. Sir, you refused all the honors. Refused the special pension. Even refused the ceremony at the White House. Why? The silence that followed was heavy. Elena was leaning against the doorframe, watching. She saw something pass through Harold's eyes. Pain. Guilt. Something he'd been carrying for decades. Because I didn't deserve it, Harold finally said. Not after what happened to Marcus. The name dropped like a bomb in the apartment. Jenkins closed his eyes for a moment. The other SEALs exchanged loaded glances. Sir, Jenkins said softly, what happened to Lieutenant Williams wasn't your fault. He was my responsibility. Harold's voice cracked for the first time. I promised his mother I'd bring him back. And I failed. Elena felt a knot form in her throat. Now she understood. The phrase Harold had said months ago, once I couldn't save the one who mattered, finally made sense. But before anyone could say anything more, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Richard Thornton was back. And this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him came 2 police officers and a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. Court order, Thornton announced, a venomous smile on his face. He handed a paper to Harold. You have 48 hours to vacate the apartment. Signed by Judge Patterson this morning. Jenkins stepped between Thornton and Harold. You're really doing this now? In front of us. You have no jurisdiction here. Thornton crossed his arms. This is a civil matter. The tenant is in default. The law is clear. Elena couldn't take it anymore. He's not in default. She stepped forward, anger burning in her chest. Harold showed me the receipts. He paid every month. You're the one refusing to register the payments. Thornton looked at her as if she were an insect. Careful, Miss Rivera. Your contract can also be reviewed at any time. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you how things work in this building. The man in the suit cleared his throat. Mr. Thornton, perhaps we should discuss this at another time. No. Thornton pointed at Harold. This man has occupied this apartment for too long paying poverty rent. I have investors interested in turning this building into luxury condos. Every month he stays here, I lose money. Jenkins stepped forward, his posture shifting subtly. From respectful to threatening. Mr. Thornton, let me explain something. He lowered his voice. This man carried 3 wounded soldiers for 2 kilometers through hostile territory under enemy fire. He took a bullet in the shoulder and kept walking. Another in the leg and kept walking. He only stopped when everyone was safe. Thornton didn't back down, but something in his eyes wavered. Now, Jenkins continued, I'm going to make some calls. And when I'm done, you'll discover there are forces in this country much greater than an eviction order. Thornton laughed, but the laugh sounded forced. Is that a threat, officer? It's a promise, sir. The police officers looked uncomfortable. The lawyer was sweating. Thornton looked around, realized he had no allies in the room, and retreated. 48 hours, he repeated, pointing at Harold. After that, I'll send the riot squad if I have to. He left, the officers and the lawyer right behind. The silence that remained was tense, electric. Jenkins turned to his team. Davis, I want a complete report on Richard Thornton in 2 hours. Financial history, previous lawsuits, everything. Yes, sir. Peterson, contact Senator Marshall's office. He owes me a favor since Kandahar. Copy that. And someone get me a real lawyer. The best there is. Harold raised his hand. Tommy, you don't have to do this. I can find another place. Jenkins knelt before the older man, holding his hands. Master Chief, you've spent 23 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. You refused recognition, refused help, refused everything this country should have given you. He squeezed Harold's hands. That ends today. You saved us. Now it's our turn. Harold looked away, but Elena saw the tears streaming down his wrinkled face. Later that night, after the SEALs had left to check into a nearby hotel, Elena stayed to help Harold organize his documents. That's when she found something that changed everything. At the bottom of a drawer, under piles of old bills, there was a yellowed envelope. Inside, photographs, newspaper clippings, and a letter never sent. The letter was addressed to Cynthia Williams, the mother of the lieutenant Harold couldn't save. Elena began to read. Dear Mrs. Williams, I write this letter every year on the anniversary of your son's death. I've never had the courage to send any of them. Marcus died in my arms. His last words were for you. He said, tell my mom I love her. And that I wasn't afraid. I should have told you this 23 years ago. But every time I tried, I saw his face. And I froze. You deserve to know that your son died a hero. I'm the one who doesn't deserve to have survived. Elena stopped reading. Her hands were trembling. There were 23 letters in that envelope. One for each year since Marcus Williams' death. And at the bottom of the envelope, an address in Chicago. Cynthia Williams still lived there. Elena looked at Harold, who had fallen asleep in the armchair, exhausted from the day. She made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call Jenkins. Because if anyone needed to receive these letters, it was Marcus's mother. And if anyone needed forgiveness after 23 years, it was Harold. What Elena didn't know was that Thornton was also making his own calls that night. And what he was planning was far worse than a simple eviction order. The 48 hours passed like a hurricane. Jenkins wasn't kidding when he said he'd make calls. The next morning, 3 lawyers from Washington's biggest firm showed up at the building. A federal prosecutor called asking for information about Richard Thornton. And a Washington Post reporter was asking questions around the neighborhood. But Thornton wasn't sitting idle either. Elena found out the hard way. When she came back from the grocery store that afternoon, she found her daughter Sophie sitting in the building's hallway, crying. The apartment door was locked with a new padlock. A notice was pinned to the wood, apartment sealed for contract violation. Contact management. Elena felt her blood boil. She stormed down the stairs, Sophie in her arms, and pounded on the door of Thornton's ground floor office. He opened it with a satisfied smile. Any problems, Miss Rivera? You locked my apartment. My things, my daughter's things, everything is in there. Unfortunately, upon reviewing the contracts, I discovered you never paid the original security deposit. That constitutes a contractual violation. That's a lie. Elena shouted. I have the receipts. Receipts can be lost. Thornton tilted his head. Especially when tenants get involved in matters that don't concern them. The penny dropped. This was retaliation. For Elena defending Harold. For her challenging Thornton in front of the seals. Sophie was trembling, scared by the yelling. Elena held her tighter, fighting back tears of rage. "You're not going to get away with this," she whispered. "I already have." Thornton shut the door in her face. Elena stood in the hallway, not knowing what to do. No apartment. No clothes. Nothing but her daughter in her arms and some grocery bags. That's when Harold's door opened. "Elena." He was standing without his cane, firmer than she'd ever seen him. "Bring Sophie in here. Now." She obeyed, still in shock. Inside the apartment, Jenkins was on the phone, his face tense. Davis was working on a laptop. 2 other SEALs were studying documents spread across the table. "What's happening?" Elena asked. Jenkins hung up the phone and turned to her. "We just found out why Thornton is so desperate to empty this building." He turned the laptop so she could see. On the screen were property records, bank transfers, intercepted emails. Elena didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. "Thornton isn't the real owner of the building," Jenkins explained. "He's just a manager. The real owners are a shell company being investigated for money laundering. Thornton is trying to sell the building before the FBI freezes the assets. He's evicting everyone to sell faster," Davis added. "He's already done this with 3 other buildings in the past 2 years. Entire families thrown out on the street." Elena felt sick. "Is this information reliable?" Jenkins smiled, a predatory smile. "My team spent 20 years gathering intelligence in war zones. Uncovering the dirt on a corrupt real estate speculator took exactly 4 hours." Harold placed his hand on Elena's shoulder. "Everything's going to be okay," he said. "I promise." But the biggest surprise was yet to come. That night, someone knocked on Harold's door. Elena opened it, expecting more trouble. She found a black woman in her 70s, white hair, tired but determined eyes. Beside her, Jenkins wore an expression Elena couldn't decipher. "This is Cynthia Williams," Jenkins said softly. "Lieutenant Marcus Williams' mother." The world stopped. Elena looked at Harold, who had risen from the armchair. His face was white. His hands were shaking. "Cynthia." His voice came out strangled. "How?" "This young woman called me yesterday." Cynthia pointed at Elena. "She told me about the letters. All 23 of them." Elena had called Chicago the night before, after finding the envelope. She'd told Cynthia everything. She'd read excerpts from the letters over the phone while the woman wept on the other end. And Cynthia had caught the first flight out. Harold staggered backward. I don't deserve." "Harold Washington." Cynthia walked up to him, holding his face in her hands. "I spent 23 years wanting to talk to you. 23 years thinking you'd abandoned me along with my son's memory. I let him die. You carried him 2 kilometers trying to save him." Tears streamed down her face. "You held his hand as he passed. You were the last person my boy saw in this world." Harold was sobbing now, his whole body shaking. "I promised I'd bring him back. Some promises can't be kept." Cynthia embraced him. "But you kept the only one that mattered. You didn't let my son die alone. You stayed with him until the end." Elena had to turn away. Sophie was sleeping on the couch, oblivious to the moment happening just feet away. Jenkins and Davis stood motionless, eyes glistening. 23 years of guilt. 23 years of self-punishment. Ending in an embrace that should have happened decades ago. The moment was interrupted by the sound of sirens. Davis looked out the window. "We've got company." Police cars were parking in front of the building. But these weren't the regular cops Thornton had brought before. These had FBI stamped on their vests. Jenkins broke into a smile. "Looks like the information we leaked reached the right people." Outside, Elena watched Thornton being led from his office in handcuffs. He was screaming about lawyers, about rights, about suing everyone. No one was listening. One of the agents approached Harold's apartment. She was an Asian woman, hair tied back, professional expression. "Master Chief Washington?" Harold released himself from Cynthia's embrace, wiping his face. "That's me. Agent Chun, FBI. We need your statement about Richard Thornton." She looked around the apartment. "And I want you to know that your case has gotten attention in Washington. A lot of attention." "What kind of attention?" The agent smiled slightly. "The kind that involves a call from the Pentagon, an article about to run in the Washington Post, and a senator very interested in knowing how an American war hero was almost thrown out on the street by a criminal." Thornton was finished. But for Elena, watching Harold and Cynthia holding hands, watching Sophie sleeping peacefully, watching the men who had risked everything to make things right, the real victory wasn't a villain's arrest. It was the healing of a 23-year-old wound. And it was only the beginning. 6 months later, the building on Morrison Avenue was unrecognizable. Not because of luxury renovations or expensive condos, but because, for the first time in years, the people who lived there weren't afraid of losing their homes. The FBI had frozen all assets linked to Thornton. The investigation revealed a money laundering scheme involving 12 other properties in 3 states. Thornton was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His lawyer tried to negotiate a reduced sentence, but the judge showed no mercy. "You profited from the suffering of vulnerable families," the judge declared at sentencing. "The elderly, single mothers, veterans. You treated them as disposable obstacles. Now you'll find out what it's like to be discarded by the system." Elena watched the sentencing on television, Sophie in her lap. When the gavel fell, she didn't feel joy. She felt relief. And something she hadn't felt in a long time: security. The building was transferred to a non-profit affordable housing organization. Rents were reduced. Tenants received long-term contracts. And on the ground floor, where Thornton's office used to be, there was now a small community clinic. Harold had suggested the idea. "That space caused a lot of suffering," he said at the meeting with the new administrators. "Now it can cause healing." The clinic was named the Marcus Williams Community Health Center. Cynthia cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, with Harold by her side. The Washington Post story had changed everything. "Forgotten War Hero: How the System Failed One of America's Greatest Soldiers," the headline swept the nation. Harold's story went viral. Millions of people read about the man who saved 47 soldiers in Mogadishu and then disappeared for 23 years, living in poverty by choice, punishing himself for a death that wasn't his fault. The calls started coming in. Veterans from across the country wanting to say thanks. Families of soldiers Harold had saved wanting to meet him. Politicians offering tributes. Celebrities wanting to tell his story. Harold refused almost all of it. "I didn't do what I did for recognition," he told Jenkins one spring afternoon. "I did it because it was right." But one thing he accepted. The Pentagon organized an official ceremony to finally present the medals Harold had refused for 2 decades. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and a new special commendation approved by Congress. The ceremony took place in Washington, at the Veterans Memorial. Elena sat in the front row, Sophie holding a small bouquet of flowers. Cynthia was beside them, silent tears streaming down her face. Behind them, the 10 SEALs who had shown up at Harold's door 6 months earlier, now in immaculate dress uniforms. The general conducting the ceremony was a black man in his early 60s. He approached Harold with a velvet box in his hands. "Master Chief Harold Washington," he announced, his voice echoing through the memorial. "This nation failed you. We forgot you when we should have honored you. We abandoned you when we should have cared for you. Today, we ask for forgiveness. And today, we finally deliver what has always been rightfully yours." Harold stood firm as an oak, but Elena saw the glisten in his eyes. When the general pinned the last medal to his chest, the SEALs saluted in unison. And then something unexpected happened. People in the audience began to stand. Veterans from other wars. Soldiers' families. Civilians who had read the story. One by one, hundreds of people rose to their feet, applauding the man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Harold looked at the crowd, then at Cynthia, then at Elena and Sophie. And he smiled. Not the sad smile Elena knew. A smile of peace. Of acceptance. Of a man who had finally allowed himself to be forgiven. 3 months later, Elena graduated from nursing school. She had returned to her studies with support from a scholarship created by the Veterans Foundation Jenkins had helped establish. Harold had insisted that part of the funds go to people who helped veterans, and Elena fit that description perfectly. "You saved me as much as any doctor could," Harold said when she tried to refuse. "Accept it. You deserve it." Sophie was now 7 years old and called Harold Grandpa. He walked her to school every morning, told her stories about his adventures, edited versions, appropriate for children. She believed every word. This time, the stories were all true. Elena got a job at the community clinic on the ground floor. She worked alongside Cynthia, who had moved to the city to be near Harold. The two women who had entered his life in such different ways were now inseparable friends. One autumn afternoon, Elena found Harold sitting on the bench in front of the building. The same spot where he used to sit alone, watching the street. Now there were flowers planted around it. A small garden the residents had created together. She sat down beside him. "What are you thinking about?" Harold was silent for a moment. "I'm thinking about how strange life is." He looked at her. "I spent 23 years hiding, thinking I didn't deserve anything. And then you showed up with an umbrella on a rainy day." Elena smiled. "Technically, you're the one who showed up with the umbrella." Details. He laughed, that husky laugh she had learned to love. "The point is, you saw me. When everyone else looked right through me, you saw me." "You saw me too," Elena replied. "When I was at my lowest, you gave me a chance." Harold held her hand. "That's how it works, you know? Kindness creates kindness. Not because we expect something in return, but because it's the right thing to do." Elena thought about everything that had happened since that rainy day. A simple act of kindness had set off a chain reaction that changed dozens of lives. Thornton was in prison. Families were safe. A clinic was healing people. A mother had found peace. A hero had been honored. All because a man offered an umbrella. And a woman accepted. Sophie came running out of the building, backpack on her shoulders. "Grandpa. Elena. Dinner's ready. Aunt Cynthia made pasta." Harold stood up, leaning on his cane. "Let's go," he said. "Family shouldn't be kept waiting." Elena stayed behind for a second, watching the two of them walk hand in hand toward the building. Sophie chattering about her day at school. Harold listening with complete attention, as if every word mattered. Because it did. The truth is simple: we never know who we're helping when we choose to be kind. We never know what stories exist behind tired faces and worn-out clothes. We never know what wounds we can heal with a small gesture. Harold Washington spent 23 years punishing himself for not being able to save one life. But in that time, without realizing it, he saved hundreds of others. Including Elena's. Including Sophie's. The best revenge against a cruel world isn't cruelty. It's persistent, stubborn, unshakable kindness. It's seeing people when everyone else looks away. It's offering an umbrella in the rain without expecting anything in return. Because sometimes, an umbrella is all someone needs to remember that hope still exists. And you? Who around you is waiting to be seen? Leave in the comments a time when a small gesture changed your life. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove kindness is never wasted.